Good evening, everyone. It's a few minutes after 6 o'clock, so I'd like to go ahead and get started with tonight's presentation. My name is Rakia Nance, and on behalf of the Anne Arundel County Department of Public Works, I'd like to thank you for joining us tonight for this presentation to talk about the Our Water program as it relates to Chelsea Beach and Magothy Beach. I would like to note that tonight's meeting is being recorded, and later on in the presentation, we will detail how you can access the recording along with the presentation slides. There are a few of the people you'll be hearing from on tonight's call. From the Department of Public Works, we have George Heiner, Ron Briggerman, and Lynn Berry. From HDR, in addition to myself, we have Brian Balchunas and also Megan Robinson. Tonight's meeting is being hosted on Zoom, and here's an overview of the features and tools you can use during the meeting. We'll be presenting quite a bit of information, and we'll be stopping along the way to address questions. We'll ask that you enter your questions into the chat box, and we will address them in the order in which they're received. You may also use the raise hand function if you'd like to speak your questions instead of typing them. We're going to ask that you please mute yourself if you're not speaking, and to ensure optimal bandwidth, please leave your cameras off. Here's a bit about how we got to this point. We've received interest from residents in the community about this program. And I do want to note that this meeting is non-binding. We're not asking you to make any type of decision or vote on anything tonight. Instead, this meeting is designed to share more about the program, and in particular, changes to the petition process for extension of wastewater service to the community. Please note that it is a community decision whether to connect to public sewer, and later on we'll describe what's involved in that process. Again, we're not here to obtain a commitment. We're simply seeking input and interest. We're not here to advocate for the program either. This is ultimately a decision that the community has to make. Here's an overview of the information we'll be discussing tonight. First, we'll talk about our water as it relates to Chelsea Beach and Magothy Beach. Then we'll discuss funding and costs, followed by information on the application and petition process, followed by next steps, and then extended Q&A. And with that, I'll turn things over to George Heiner from the Department of Public Works to discuss a bit of background about the Our Water program. George?
Okay, thanks, Rakia. So I'm George Heiner with the Anne Arundel County Department of Public Works in the Utility Design Group. And I'm going to be talking in a few spots tonight. But the first section here, I'm going to talk a little bit about the program background and sort of why the county is interested in seeing some more septic connections. So the Our Water program is an integrated program that's been developed to reach our water quality goals. It's a long-term strategy to improve the health of our waterways and the Chesapeake Bay while we strengthen water resiliency. You can go to the next slide. There's 5 pieces to the program. One is small systems upgrade. This is projects where we're going to be looking at taking over small privately run wastewater treatment plants and upgrading them for nitrogen removal and kind of sort of to be more modernized. We have our ongoing stormwater management, which is run out of the Bureau of Watershed Protection and Restoration. Those projects, they've done hundreds of projects throughout the county, and they're going to be continuing progress on that. We will have a groundwater resiliency element to the program, and then wastewater treatment enhancements. So over the last 10 years, the county has made a significant investment with state money as well in upgrading all of its wastewater treatment plants, and they're achieving excellent performance right now. So we're going to look to maintain that performance level and then see where we can enhance that when it's possible. And the other element that we're really here to talk about tonight is the septic sewer connection program. Can you go to the next slide? So why is DPW interested in seeing more septic systems connected? The main reason is that traditional septic systems are not as effective at removing pollution, and specifically we're talking about nitrogen here. Compared with our wastewater treatment plants, our treatment plants produce 90%, sorry, have 90% less pollution. And I guess what I want to emphasize is on this particular, the comparison here is our wastewater treatment plant effluent compared with the septic tank effluent. And there is treatment that occurs in your soil, and so after you go to the drain field. And for some things that can be effective, depends on the characteristics of your drain field and soil and how far the water table is. But the conventional septic systems, even through the soil, they're not very effective at removing nitrogen. So our main interest in this is looking at ways to reduce nitrogen loads to the bay and to the local waterways. Can you go to the next slide? Overall, Anne Arundel County has more than 40,000 septic systems. 13,000 are in what's called the critical area, which is within 1,000 feet of a tidal waterway. That's actually a quarter of the entire total within the state, because there's so much shoreline in Anne Arundel County. That's really why it has that high number, relatively high number of septic systems. Septic loads are a significant source in the county. And in addition to eventually contributing to the Chesapeake Bay loads, they impact local rivers and waterways. Can you go to the next slide? So there are some benefits very generally to the public when a septic system would be connected, and that is, as I mentioned, less total nitrogen discharge to the bay. This will help us maintain compliance going forward with the state's Chesapeake Bay TMDL. That's the total maximum daily loading, sometimes referred to as like the pollution diet, and fewer nutrients and other pollutants in the local waterways. All of the county's watersheds are actually listed as impaired for nutrients and other pollutants. That's in addition to the Chesapeake Bay itself. So there can also be some benefits to the homeowner, and these are very site specific. Some may or may not apply to your circumstances as an owner. In some cases, the size of the septic system is tied to the size of the house, and so there can be restrictions or constrictions on what you can actually do with the house related to the septic system. There's also space required for your drain field, and very often a spare drain field, and that restricts what you can do with some of the land around your property. And there can be a positive impact on the home value. This is another one that's very site specific, so if that's something that you're interested in looking into, we would suggest that you consult a realtor for that. So some other possible benefits, this graphic is a little condensed, but in most cases there's separation between the well and the septic tank in order to avoid the possibility of cross contamination. If the septic system is hooked up to the public sewer, that's going to greatly reduce those possibilities. There's also, as I mentioned before, improvement to your local waterway through the septic system connection, and you can avoid the costs associated with septic systems. And we have a general number for some of the costs on the next slide. So the main ongoing cost is, on the traditional one, is the pump out, which is roughly $300. What becomes more significant is a drain field replacement, and those prices can be significant depending on the nature of the work. BAT systems is a best available technology. That's actually a septic system that has been designed to remove nitrogen. And they're more complicated mechanically and electrically, so they cost more money as a annual operating cost. And the drain field is a similar element though. So what's different between the BAT and the traditional is sort of what's in and around the septic tank, not really the drain field per se. So we have overall, our overall need here is to protect our waterways and improve the environment and water quality. We've developed this process, and we're gonna talk more about the details of how the process works. Where if the neighborhood is interested, they can submit an application, they can learn about the funding options, and if they're interested, they can move to the petition process. And our overall goal with this program on the septic to sewer side is to see if we can connect 6,000 homes over the next 30 years. And this, if we're able to connect this balanced with the other components of the program, we think we can maintain our nutrient loading goals for Chesapeake Bay compliance. Is that? Okay, so before I get to the next slide, let me, I know we had some people that were interested in water. I forgot to mention this at the beginning. So we're going to talk a little bit about water later, but the central piece of this program, which is, as Rakia mentioned, is really changes to the sewer petition process. So a sewer petition process is, or a water petition, but in this case a sewer, is when the residents in a neighborhood or a community request Public Works to extend service to their neighborhood. And so it's a request from the citizens to the local government to extend the service into their neighborhood. And because projects need to be self-sufficient, okay, then what happens is the costs for the project are reimbursed to the county. And we're going to talk a lot more about that later on. But in order to make septic connections more affordable, there were changes made to the sewer petition process. Okay, and those changes were not made to the water petition process. So I guess I wanted to just mention, we'll be talking about water perhaps a little bit later, but the program changes that we're going to talk in more detail about, starting with this slide, are only for the sewer part. So the septic connection program really started quite a ways back when what was known as the Phase 2 Watershed Implementation Plan from the state came out. This was for the total maximum daily load for the Chesapeake Bay. And that target at that time was that Anne Arundel County should reduce its septic system load by close to 50%. So we did a lot of concept planning at those early phases to try to see where we might be able to make those connections. And so a lot of the information and costs and some of the areas we're going to see in a little bit that were really developed based on that. We later initiated a septic task force, and this was a citizen group that included business representatives, environmental representatives, and community representatives. We worked with that task force to develop input on policies or prioritization criteria, subsidies and incentives, and ultimately that task force helped develop legislative changes that were finished up last year and early this year. And the two that we're going to talk the most about are a subsidy, which is that DPW can offer a subsidy towards a sewer connection project, and a deferment, a partial deferment of the annual assessment. And along with these program changes, we developed along with the petition process changes, we developed a program That involves an application process, and we will talk about that a little bit later today, so that we can kind of review possible projects and decide where to apply the subsidy in different years. So the next slide. So if you've been on our water website, you've seen references to eligible communities. So on this slide, we're going to explain that a little bit more. Here on the green is all of the planned sewer service areas within Anne Arundel County. And in the blue are eligible areas for the program. So these blue areas are places where there are septic systems. And to be an eligible area, it had to be in there were several key criteria. So one was if you were in the critical area. Another was if an area was in what's known as an on-site wastewater management problem area. And then another was whether it was an area that we had already developed a layout for as part of our earlier planning efforts. So in this area, it's in the critical area, at least a large part of it is in the critical area, and I believe a large part of it is also in the on-site wastewater management problem area. So the on-site wastewater management problem area are areas designated by the health department where there are certain characteristics that can make it challenging for septic systems. And those can be a couple different factors, but some of them have to do with the size of the lots themselves. Okay, can we go to the next slide? So what we're showing here is the potential area that could be served. And as I mentioned, we had started these very concept level layouts quite some time ago to try to look at what possible areas could be hooked up to public sewer. So in this area, we had identified 2 sub-drainage areas, and there was a small pumping station associated with each area, and then it was going to pump out of the area up to the north. And I guess a couple of things I wanted to make sure I clarify here is that there is no active county project that we are planning for this area. We did these layouts as part of that initial concept level planning as to if we had to hook up 20,000 septic systems, where would we be trying to do that? So this is an area that has a feasibly technically, I guess I'm saying that backwards, but the actual project area in a petition is defined by the neighborhood or the community, the people that actually send the petition to the county. So a petition area can be, we're showing 2 drainage areas here. In concept, it could be one huge petition that included all of them, but it could also be smaller segments. There's a couple constraints when we do the petition areas that it needs to be continuous, though, from the point and connection to the county system, which, as I mentioned, is further to the north. So we'd have to have continuous properties in the petition area, but once you get into an area, there is some flexibility on where the boundaries are drawn. If there were if there were neighborhoods that were interested or a broader area, we would certainly be willing to talk to anybody about what a possible project area would look like. But I just want to make sure that everyone understands this is not, there is no county defined area. There's no county capital project that we're planning for this area. Okay, so with that, I'm going to pause for questions. This was really our segment on the background for the program, and next we'll be talking about the costs, the anticipated costs, and where the funding is for that. So, Ricky, I'm not sure, did we have any questions?
No, none on the background of the program, no.
Okay, so with that, I'm going to hand it off to Brian Balchunas. Brian is with HDR, and they're a consulting firm that has been helping us with all different aspects of the program. I see a couple questions, so Brian, if you hold up, I don't want to take these right now. Generally, what time frame are we looking at? We'll talk about that a little bit later, but it would be 3 to 4 years overall, so it's a pretty long process. This is a very large area, so it could take a little bit longer, but it's yeah. Would we foresee sometime in the future where septic connections become required rather than come with an incentive like this program? I think so. I think the question is, is there a possibility we would make connections be mandatory? We don't envision that at this time, but I mean, if we don't have the success we are picturing on the overall program, I think that's a possibility. But I mean, if we're able to implement the different program aspects, we're trying to keep this incentivized system, and that was excuse me, one of the recommendations from the septic task force was to try to create a prioritized and incentivized system instead of a mandatory program. Where would the pumping stations potentially be located at? So in each situation, we would look for, so we're going to want to be in a low spot because we're going to want to pick up as much flow by gravity. And then we would also look for a vacant lot. We don't need a really large footprint for the pumping stations. So we would really be looking for lots that either are vacant or maybe a community lot of some sort. If the sewer is extended, is it still optional for each household? So we'll go over that in a little more detail a little further. The question is was this initiated by a community, a resident, or is this from Anne Arundel County government? So we've had interest from several different people in the community through our water program website. And we've been doing meetings like this starting in June, and we're going to be probably wrapping up in November. So what we've been doing is if communities have heard about the program and they want to learn more, we've been coming out and doing these informational meetings to present at least what area we think it would be served, and as you're going to see, what we think the costs are going to be. So it's not, when I was saying it, so the county government involvement is, these would eventually be DPW projects if it was a petition project. And from a program standpoint, the subsidies and deferments are new to create an incentive for people to make connections. I see a question about the time frame. So that is, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's 3 to 4 years from sort of where we are right now. And could we use one pumping station instead of two? I believe in this area we had 2 separate drainage directions that the flow was going, so I'm not sure we would be able to consolidate that into one pumping station. Okay, that's great. Feel free to keep putting the questions in the chat box. We have a lot more information to present, but when we pause, we'll be glad to get caught up, and we can always we'll be around for questions at the end of the presentation. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Brian, and he's going to go over the costs and the funding.
Yeah, thanks, George. So we're going to start just talking about the costs themselves, the project costs, and what it takes to build something like this. As you can imagine, especially in an area like Magothy and Chelsea Beach, a built up area, there are significant costs. But then we're gonna, after we hit on costs, we'll talk about funding and funding opportunities to help lower the cost to the individual homeowners. So first, just talking about typical per project, per property total cost to connect. And we've divided this into three main segments, as you can see on the graph there. The first and the largest piece of the pie is the project costs. And these are the costs really in the public right of way, in the streets. And these are the costs to convey the sewage to the local wastewater treatment plant. So it will be all the sewers in the streets, the manholes, the collection, the pumping station, the force main to discharge that out of the community. So that is the biggest piece of the overall cost when we think of the big picture here. And that includes typically a clean out just inside the property line for the local, or for the property sewer to connect to. In some cases, in low-lying areas, that clean out will be replaced by a grinder pump because it's not feasible for gravity collection in that area. So some homeowners in low-lying areas could potentially have grinder pumps to pump up into the system. The light blue piece is the private on-site costs, and these would be the costs that the homeowner is typically responsible for, and we'll talk about in a minute some potential funding to help the homeowners in that case. But these are the costs basically inside the property to connect to the sewer cleanout, and this includes abandonment of the existing septic tank and any new plumbing required to get the sewage out to the cleanout. And then the third piece is the capital facility connection charge, and this is really to pay for the costs of the existing county infrastructure that you would be connecting into a vast existing county infrastructure with that, and so that charge helps pay for some of those costs. I do see some questions. Let me go through a couple more slides and then we'll pause and get caught up with the question. So a common question is what happens to the septic tank? It does require abandonment when a property is connected to public sewer. You also, you need to pump out the tank. Depending on whether it's a concrete or metal tank, depends on how it gets abandoned. The concrete tank can just be filled in with stone. A metal tank would need to be crushed and backfilled. But there are county regulations and licensed contractors who can help with the abandonment of the septic tank. So the next slide is, as George talked about, the county's looked at layouts for a lot of areas, including Chelsea and Magothy Beach here, and developed a wide range of costs, and developed this histogram to kind of represent typical project costs. These are all based on conceptual layouts, have not done detailed engineering yet at this point, but based on historical costs and other things that the county has seen. And you can see that the Chelsea and Magothy Beach is kind of right in the middle. Things working in your favor for project costs are, it's a large property area, so you get an economy of scale from that large property area. Generally, smaller lot sizes help reduce the cost per property. But some of the things working against you is the proximity to the existing sewer. The force main out of the community will be quite long to get into the county's existing system. You can see some of the other factors that are contributors to project costs, but again, you're kind of right in the middle of all the projects that the county has looked at. And then if we look at project costs, again, these would typically be the responsibility of the homeowner, but there are some funding mechanisms for these that I'll go over here in a little bit. But you can kind of see two bumps in the histogram here. And really most property owners should see a on-site project cost of less than $6,000, say. But that higher bump on the more expensive side, that would typically be larger properties that have a larger distance from the home to the public right of way. So how far you have to run that sewer to get to the public right of way could have challenging property topography, which causes things to be deep, or significant property or driveway restoration. Again, for most properties of average size with the home relatively close to the public right of way, we would expect to be kind of on that left-hand side of the histogram. And these are all based on historical numbers that the county health department has seen as they track use of some of the funding for connection to public sewers that's available from the state. So let's pause there and catch up on some of the questions.
Sure. Going back up to the question, what about seniors in the community that can't take on the additional cost?
So we're going to talk a little bit more about the possible deferment for elderly and income related, and so I'd like to defer that one to a little bit later.
Okay. The next question has to do with overflows. What measures does the county take to keep pumping stations from overflowing? Back River has a lot of issues with sewage flowing, in which we don't want in the Magothy.
Well, I mean, there's always sewer overflow is always a risk. We mitigate that to the extent that we can when we're designing a new station by putting a larger wet well. That's the main area where the sewage would come into. So we use a larger wet well. We put in bypass pumping connections that would allow us to bring trucks out in certain instances. We put generators at new facilities. So we really try to mitigate the possibilities of overflows through the design features that we put into the new stations. I think our record has been pretty successful, but there's always a risk of sewer overflow. I think in terms of Back River, in terms of the comment, I'm not sure. I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that our system is much smaller than Baltimore County and Baltimore City. So I assume you're talking about just the Back River, but the Back River wastewater plant is sized for like 180 million gallons of treatment a day, and our Cox Creek facility is 15 million gallons a day. So there is when you hear about overflows in the news, for example, in say Baltimore County or Baltimore City, generally our infrastructure is not that size. But again, we're going to take all the measures we can to make sure we don't have any sewer overflows, because that's our policy and that's our goal.
Next question has to do with the water service, potential water service. Even though water supply is not part of the sewer project, if the streets will be torn up, would it make sense to at least lay the water lines for future use?
So we would not put them in and not have people hook up to them, because financially that's not a self-sustaining way to approach it. So we do get the question a lot, is it more cost effective if we put in water at the same time, and specifically with respect to the roads? And so I think there is some savings, but if the savings are relative to if you did a sewer project like next year and you did a water project 10 years from now or something like that. Generally, we put the water line and the sewer line on opposite sides of the road. So if we're doing just a sewer line, we would try to see if maybe we only have to pave one side of the road. And then if we end up putting the water line on the other side, we've widened the amount of paving that needs to get done. But where you do get some savings is that economy of scale. I mean, Brian was mentioning it in respect to size of the community, but there's also some economy in having the same contractor out there doing the work. And then there's commonality in the design and the inspection.
Okay, the next question is with regard to the private on-site costs. How long is the $2,000 per year payment? I just installed a BAT system that was very expensive. What happens to that?
So if you recently installed a BAT system, and we'll get into a little more of the details of when somebody has to connect, but you can get an exception on the connection requirement, an extension on that, I should say. And separately, if when we talk about where some of the funding comes from, if you had state money to help with the BAT installation, you would still be able to get state funds to help with your septic connection.
All right. Is it correct that the incentives and grants?
Yeah. Let's make sure we answered the first question too. How long is the $2,000 per year payment? We will talk about that here in a minute. The assessment and how it works and the length of the term. So we will answer that question here in a moment.
Thanks, Brian. The next question, is it correct that the incentives and grants that help with the homeowner's cost may not always be available?
Yeah, I think that's an accurate statement. I mean, our intent is, so the subsidy that we're going to talk about is the DPW subsidy, and the grant is really from the state BRF fund. It's our intention to maintain this new program, but I mean, in theory, could it change due to circumstances? Yes, that's possible.
Okay. And if a large number of people get deferments, does that shift more of the project cost onto those who do not, or is it wholly shifted to future owners of a specific property?
We're going to talk more about the deferments and how they work, and I think if at that point you still have this question about the deferments, I'd be glad to come back to that. I think it might be easier after we get through that discussion.
Okay, so it looks like the next few questions have to do with cost and billing. So I'm going to ask that we defer those until we get through these next few slides that address some of that.
Yeah, I would just comment. So there's one comment that the costs are grossly underestimated. As everybody knows, there's a lot of pricing fluctuations. The numbers we're showing now were developed earlier in the summer, but they were taken from historical projects that we've done in the past. And as we move forward, we're always going to be trying to provide the best estimate that we can. With respect to the payoff period, we'll talk more about that, what that payoff period looks like. It's not 20 years.
George, there is one more related, not related to billing. I don't know if you want to touch on that one now. It says the Marley Creek pumping station overflows all the time. Sewage can commonly be smelled while using Route 10 in the area after rain events.
Okay. I mean, we have. If there's recent events, I'm not aware of them, and we certainly would want to know about that. I don't know.
All overflows are reportable, right? Correct, George?
Yeah, absolutely.
On the county's website, so.
Yeah. So if you see something or smell something, we would encourage you to call the county about it, so that we can find out if something's happening.
Okay, let me go into some of the funding, and as George said, and then Ricky said, hopefully this will answer some of the questions. But we will make sure to try and hit on some of those as we go through this. So the funding sources, how this gets paid for, really right now we're identifying 3 areas of funding sources. The first is the county subsidy, and we'll talk here in a minute who's eligible for that subsidy and what their eligibility is. But if you are eligible, that will be up to 25% of the total project cost. So the big blue piece of the pie I identified previously. The state has Bay Restoration Fund grants available. And this is a state program that has been funded for the last 15 years, probably at least, that originally was for upgrading wastewater treatment plants, but as those have become upgraded, can also be used for septic connection upgrades. And there's 2 sources of funding there. One would be right to the homeowner to pay for those on-site private costs, and potentially there are funds available for reducing some of the assessment as well. And then lastly, the remaining costs will be passed to the homeowner through the annual assessment. But one additional note is that the county would look to take advantage of low interest state loans to reduce those homeowner annual assessment costs. And I think this area will be a prime candidate for getting those low interest loans. Excellent. So the subsidies, as George talked about, there is an application process open now that the county is accepting applications and would be ranking projects to determine who would be eligible for the subsidy. An area like this with 1,200 homes, if this whole, obviously that's a huge project. The county's looking to get 200 homes per year, so this would be 6 years worth of projects. So there'd be a significant investment discussion on how an area like this would proceed. The subsidies are subject to available funding, and there is an income test for these. This income levels are consistent with the state Bay Restoration Funds funding. So if annual gross income is less than $300,000 a year, get up to 25% of the per property project cost. Greater than $300,000 a year will get half of that, or 12.5%. And the subsidy is used directly to reduce the total assessment for the project. And at one point, to answer one of the previous questions as well, that the subsidy is applied. There are those income tests, but it's not applied. It's applied uniformly across the project area. The Bay Restoration Fund program can, as I said previously, provide assistance with those private on-site costs. And if there's funds left over, it can also be used to pay the capital facility connection charge. It is available once the sewer is installed and the sewer main is extended. It is administered through the Anne Arundel County Health Department. It's not a direct payment to a homeowner. That Health Department administers that process and pays the licensed master plumber and the county for the CFCC. Funds here could be available up to $20,000 per home. So if you think of that kind of maybe $4,000 to $6,000 average homeowner on-site cost plus the $10,000 CFCC, about $15,000 for those. So this should cover most, if not all, of those on-site costs. It is limited each fiscal year, but we're working with the state to develop a programmatic approach where we have guaranteed availability of this funding and potential other funds as well. So talking about the cost information and how that gets translated into the assessment. So what we've done to date, as we said, is kind of conceptual level estimating. And as George noted, there's a lot of volatility in the market right now. But knowing that these projects are 3 to 4 years off for construction, we've kind of let the market play out. But should a petition be initiated, the county would perform a more detailed engineering study and develop a construction cost estimate from that engineering study, and that would take into account current market conditions. To that construction cost, the project costs also include any site investigations, surveys, borings, design, easements for a pumping station, for example, inspections overhead. That constitutes the total project cost, or that dark blue piece of the pie I showed earlier. And then from that, if a project area if a pump station, a smaller project area wanted to come in, but still needed a pump station that was oversized, for example, to accept a larger project area in the future, the county would subtract out those kind of oversized facilities for the future connection. They would subtract out the subsidy and any straight state grants and add in the county incurred interest, and that determines the net assessable amount. And then each property owner's annual assessment would be the net assessable amount divided by the total number of households, and then also divided by the 40-year term. And so one of the other things to lower the average annual cost that the county has done is allow for payback of these assessments over a 40-year term. And then we're going to show some numbers here, some assessment basis. Our assumptions assume that $15,000 from the state go to you to pay the on-site costs, and that we can use that other $5,000, so $20,000 total from the state, to help lower the assessment. For those eligible for the full subsidy, includes the 25% county subsidy. And then the one thing we haven't talked about yet is this deferment. So everyone in the project area would be eligible to defer 50% of the annual assessment. And we'll talk. So all that does is reduce your annual payment by 50%. But you are responsible for paying that deferred portion off, and Ron will talk a little bit about that repayment here in the future. So anybody in the project area is eligible for that 50% deferral, and it does not impact what others would pay. Whether somebody accepts a deferral or not doesn't impact what somebody else is paying. And there is a county code availability. I think this was another question for 100% deferment, and that is for elderly and low income or permanently disabled to have the option to defer 100%. Elderly there is 60 and over, and the low income is defined in the code as a percentage of average income for the area. We can get specifics if people are interested in that. Then for the greater than $300,000 a year, it's just half the county subsidy and half the state funding. And lastly, vacant lots would not get a subsidy. They would not get a deferment, and they would not get bay restoration funding. They would obviously not connect, but they would be charged an annual assessment for the project costs. So this is kind of a comparison, and we have put kind of a wide range on potential cost here to reflect, the conceptual nature of where we're at. So we've taken the project estimate, and the low side is 80% of the project estimate, and the high side is 140% of the current project estimate, and shown what kind of the annual yearly cost would be for a homeowner in this area. These costs not only include the assessment, but also a usage charge for sewage. There was a question earlier about how you get charged for sewage. It's just a flat, if you don't have water, it's just a flat quarterly fee based on average annual usage in the county. It equates to about $130 per quarter or $420 per year. So those numbers are in these bar charts here. So somebody just taking a subsidy with income less than $300,000, their total yearly cost would be about $1,600 to $2,600 per year. That includes the $420 usage charge, so your assessment would be about $1,200 to $2,200 per year. If you take the 50% deferment, you can lower that annual assessment to, instead of $1,200 to $2,600 to $1,100. And again, those ranges are just conservative numbers right now. We'll talk about when you would actually vote on a project, you will be given a firm number for what that assessment would be. And the 100% deferment is just paying the annual usage charges of $420 per year. You can see the cost for the higher income and the vacant lots. The vacant lots doesn't have a usage charge because they're not connected. That's just the assessment. And then last slide, and we'll pause here after this I see a lot of questions, so we'll pause after this slide here and have Rakia help us catch up on questions. But the options, we've hit on all of these before. The private side costs, use the Bay Restoration Fund grants, capital facility connection charge, can use Bay Restoration funds. Anything that's not paid off by Bay Restoration funds can be paid off at the time of connection, or it can be financed with your annual assessment rolled into the assessment. And then the assessment options are paid over 40 years. There is no prepayment opportunity here because the county is incurring the interest for that project. And you can defer up to 50% with the deferred portion due at sale or at the end of 4 years, which Ron will talk about here in a minute. But before we go there, why don't we catch up on some questions for you?
All right, jumping back in, a couple of questions related to a potential pumping station. Would properties near pumping stations be prone to consistent odor issues?
Well, we put odor control measures at all the pumping stations, and we do have a lot of pumping stations in residential areas, but I'm not going to say that a sewage pumping station might not have odors. So I think, we generally try to also see where we can site things that are going to be, as far away from nearby properties. That's not always, we're not always able to do that, certainly, but we will have odor control measures, and when there are issues, residents are always welcome to contact us, and we'll try to take measures to prevent it or mitigate it.
All right, and then somewhat related to that, George, are you able to describe where a potential pumping station might be?
It'll be a little general, I think, at this point, but we would look for, my recollection, and Brian, you can correct me if I'm off track, I think there was more or less a sort of a drainage area on the western side, a drainage area on the eastern side. We would want to look for any county-owned property first. So we want to be in the low spot, and then we would want to look at county-owned property if there is any. If there isn't, is there some community-owned property that we might be able to, get an easement on to build a facility? And then the last spot would be if it's a vacant lot, we would talk to that lot owner about the possibility of that. I know there's a few community parcels on both the eastern and the western side, so I think if we were picking this up as a schematic design, that's probably what we would try to look at.
Okay, next question having to do with the subsidy. Are the based on income subsidies for all these different programs steered at all under $300,000, and are they reassessed every year until the project is paid off, or once, for example, at the time of application to participate?
So that's a great question. The assessments don't actually start until after the project is completed, and so I think that would be the time frame when those income limitations would be would come into effect. And the 300,000 tier is the same. It's the same tiered system that the state uses. So for the BRF septic system funding, they have the same $300,000 match. So we had set the subsidy up to parallel the state's requirement.
George, it would only be one time, right? That income test would be once.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Yeah.
Not reassessed not redone every.
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
Yes. Next is a comment about the impact on seniors on fixed income. This will be costly for those residents.
So we're going to talk a little bit more about the deferment in a few slides. But yes, I mean there is an expense to the projects. I guess I would back up and say, this is what we're really talking about tonight is changes to the sewer petition process to make it more affordable. Prior to these program changes, the payoff was over 30 years. There was no deferment and there was no subsidy. So we get the reaction about the costs a lot, frankly, but it was more costly prior to these changes, and the intent of these changes was to hopefully make it more affordable for different communities, so that we can see some more septic system petitions go forward. We really don't have many septic system many sewer extension petitions go forward because of the cost. There's been some water petition projects that have gone forward, but generally the water projects are less costly than the sewer projects.
Okay, if a vacant lot becomes a new construction, does it become eligible for subsidy or the BRF?
If a vacant lot becomes a new construction, so this would probably be tied to the time that the assessment is done. So if it was vacant at the time of the assessment, then there would be no subsidy, no deferment. So the code changes specifically talk about residential dwellings as the focus of the subsidy and partial deferment.
All right. How long are the costs? Forever or 10 years?
So I think, as Brian mentioned a little bit, the payoff for the sewer assessment is 40 years. If you were separately, you were doing a water petition, that payoff is a 30-year period. The private side costs that we've talked about are not covered by the assessment, so those are paid off under whatever arrangement the owner has with the plumber. Although we anticipate that the BRF funding should cover most of those on-site costs.
Okay, so those potential 40 years are financed at cost to the homeowner paying interest.
George, I can take that.
Yeah, thanks.
This is Ron Briggerman. I work in DPW Financial Services, and the interest that is paid is the interest that the county incurs to finance the project. So you're not paying interest. We're not charging you interest per se. We're just passing along the interest that the county had to pay to finance the project.
And actually, that's a good point. I've forgotten. I don't know if we mentioned this, but Brian mentioned the low interest loans that we would expect to be able to get as a sewer connection project, because there's a ranking system in the state for determining how they're going to disperse, the BRF state grants, or loans. And there's also a process for water, but I'm not sure if this community would score as well on water as it would on sewer. So sometimes we see a different financing rate. Let's say the county's normal financing rate is higher than what's being offered by the state, so you would see possibly a higher financing charge on a water project because of the cost incurred by the county on that.
All right, will we be given the location of the pumping stations before we vote to proceed?
Yes, we'll talk in a little more detail about that. That would be when we do what's called a schematic design or a preliminary engineering report, and we would present all of that.
This question I know about costs being transferable. We'll address that in the next set of slides, so I'll ask to delay that one. Another question about location of the pumping station. A comment that sounds like it would be mandatory eventually. How does the county track when a property owes a deferment? Is a lien placed against the property so that the total is paid when the house is sold?
George, once again, Ron Briggerman here.
Thank you.
There is a flag on the account, and the assessment does serve as a lien on the property. So yes, before the property could transfer, costs would have to be made available and disclosed by law to potential buyers.
Okay, and then this last question before we pick back up on the slides, where does the sewage processing take place?
So flow from this area would go to our Cox Creek wastewater treatment plant, which is further to the north.
Okay, looks like there's also a question trying to clarify the separate costs described.
We're gonna talk more. Ron is going to actually go over a few slides in just a few minutes that will summarize some of this. So maybe let's defer that, and we'll have Ron go through the next couple slides and see if that addresses some of the questions.
All right, folks. Like I say, I'm Ron Briggerman. I work in the financial services section of Department of Public Works. And what we're talking about here is the ability to delay making payments or to defer them. So we have a couple of different options for you. The first one, as was mentioned earlier, is available to all residential homeowners in a project area. So all of those improved lots those owners, it's not you don't have to apply or do anything. You're just going to be, if you wish to go for the deferral, you can defer up to 50% of the payment. And when you do that, you're going to take, in the partial deferral example, this example is with 50% taken as the option. So you have a 40-year total assessment, estimated $65,000, the yearly assessment without a deferral. So if you just paid the amount due for 40 consecutive years, it's $1,625 a year. The 50% deferral, if you took that option, you would defer $32,500. So that would be half of it. So you would only pay $812.50 per year for the time until you transfer your house by deed. There's a deed transfer, or 40 years, whichever occurs first. So the total due on transfer, no matter when you sell it, if you take this option to pay $812.50 per year rather than the $1,625, if you sell your house 1 year later, you owe $32,500. If you sold your house at 10 years or 20 years, you would pay $32,500. And while you were going through those years, you would have been paying that $812.50 rather than $1,625. So once you sold your house and you paid the $32,500 and you had been paying the $812.50, the assessment continues for the next homeowner at $812.50 per year until it is paid off in 40 years. So the portion that gets transferred to the new homeowner or a subsequent homeowner would be $812.50 per year, while you, on the other hand, have paid $812.50 per year and paid $32,500 at the time you transfer your home. So you have to look at it, make sure it makes sense for you, but it is a way to lower your payment by 50% while you're proceeding through the number of years. If we go on to the next slide with the full deferral repayment, in this situation, this is only for qualifying property owners. The people that can qualify for this, like Brian mentioned earlier, are elderly, which is 60 years of age or older, and those people have to meet income eligibility requirements. So those are all available and will be published and shared with you, but ultimately you have to meet the income guidelines and be 60 years of age or older. Or you could be 100% disabled, and the code discusses exactly how that disability is determined and what qualifies as being totally disabled for this program. In this example, we still have that $65,000 assessment, and that payment is $1,625 per year. If you choose to defer it, the full deferral option, you pay nothing each year. So each year, $1,625 is set aside or deferred. And the example would be if you sold your home after 10 years, you would pay 10 times that $1,625 or $16,250. The continuing assessment for the next owner would be $1,625 per year. You would have paid your $16,250, and then that remaining balance up to $65,000 would be paid by the subsequent owner. So when you sell your house, you're only paying the years that you deferred times that $1,625. Looking at the next slide, there's a comparison. So if you look at the deferment payback comparison, the amount required at property transfer, we have that 40-year, $65,000 assessment, $1,625 per year. The examples here if you sold your house after 5 years with the 50% septic connection deferment, at that point you pay the $32,500. After 10 years, $32,500. After 15, $32,500, and so forth. And as you were doing that, each year that passed, you were paying that $812.50 annually, rather than paying the $1,625. So if you look at the years when you sell your house, the $32,500 is always paid under that 50%. If you look at the 100% elderly with income and disabled deferment, after 5 years, you're just multiplying it out. The $1,625 times 5 is $8,125, and you had been paying zero all along. Then at 10 years, $16,250, and so forth, as you see down there. When you get halfway through 20 years, halfway through the 40 years, you would have paid half of the assessment, deferred it, and then have to pay it at transfer, $32,500. As I said before, it's extremely important for you to take a look at the two options, decide if either are right for you, and it has to make sense to you. When you look at the partial deferment, since you're paying $32,500 no matter when you sell it, your house, if you're going to be in your house a short term, that might not make sense. If you're going to be there for the long haul and be there for many years, that might help you by only paying half of the annual assessment, $812.50, rather than the $1,625. But it takes serious thought and planning as to what you think you should do in this case.
Okay, thanks, Ron.
Sure, George. Thank you.
I see we have a
Yeah,
lot
we've
of
got
questions.
quite a few questions.
Yeah, so let's before we get into the process, let's get caught up on the questions.
Okay, it looks like the resident has done some calculations to figure, it looks like the project cost perhaps for the entire area at $96 million. I think that's more of a comment.
Okay.
Then a resident asking for clarification on the separate charges. To be clear, the under $300,000, no deferment of $1,600 to $2,600 cost is what we pay for 40 years. I'm not understanding all the separate charges here.
Okay, so let's go back to Brian, do you want to go back to the slide where you had the pie chart with the different pieces of the cost?
Sure.
And let's
maybe
just walk
go to the bar chart, Ricky, go to the bar chart with the cost.
Okay.
So the 1,600 to 2,600 there for the people taking the subsidy only includes $420 per year for sewage charges. That covers the operations and maintenance costs for the county to run their wastewater collection and treatment systems. And then the remaining approximately $1,200 to $2,200 would be the total assessment for paying the project costs plus the county incurred interest. That does take into account the subsidy and any state funding available. And again, is a very wide range because everything is conceptual in that nature. The calculated project cost is kind of what, or assessment, I'm sorry, is what Ron presented, about $1,600 per year. So, what our average is, or our mean is about $1,600 per year for the assessment, plus $400 per year for the usage charges.
Okay, thanks, Brian. Another question, a comment about cost. Then another question, will the sewage be pumped to AACo treatment plant in Baltimore?
No, so flow from this area would go to the county's Cox Creek wastewater treatment plant, which is right next to the power plant in the Brandon Shores power plant. That's our largest facility, and it's really one of the best performing facilities in the state. We have a what's known as a membrane bioreactor system, and part of where we see some benefit in making these connections is to take advantage of the performance that we're getting at our facilities, not just Cox Creek, but all of our facilities are performing very well.
All right. And how does having a property with a public sewer connection affect the value of a property?
I think this is a difficult one for us to answer. I believe intuitively think that it increases the value, but we're really hesitant to put any kind of number on that. I would suggest if that's a real factor in your thinking, that you try to talk to a realtor about that type of what might be commonly seen. Some of the I guess one other aspect to think about it is if connecting to the public sewer alleviates some other restriction that you might have, whether it's a building addition or the ability to do something with your yard. That could be not so much maybe valuable to you, maybe valuable to a future owner. But those are actually pretty site-specific circumstances as well.
Okay, the next question is related to confirm $65,000 would not be explicitly added to my home value.
I think, Ron, I think this question is, if I understand it, you mean, is that going to show up on your state tax as assessable value? We don't, the state does its assessments in however it does it. So I can't really speak to that. I don't think any of us can really.
I agree, George. I don't think, a common sense approach to me, from my point of view, would be that no, it wouldn't add that much, but it may add something. But we're just not part of that process to be able to give you a good answer to that. The state would have to answer that.
Okay. Is the assessment based on a frontage? What if you live on a corner?
That used to be the way with a front foot, where you would basically measure the front of the property, the back of the property, add them together and divide by 2. We don't use a front foot assessment anymore. We had legislation introduced such that the calculation is now based on what's called an equivalent dwelling unit, or EDU. And basically that is in a residential area. It's going to be one EDU, one equivalent dwelling unit for each house. So each house has the same, and it's not calculated on a footage basis.
Yeah, there were a few other changes to the petition code that we really didn't talk about tonight. They were a little bit more administrative. That was one of them, to move away from the front foot assessment approach to a per EDU, since each house is getting the same value. That was feedback we got from the task force, and actually other feedback was kind of what we're doing tonight. The task force said the process was confusing and the county needed to do a better job of explaining it. So that's one of the things we've been trying to do this year, is explain the petition process through these different outreach meetings.
All right, next question is the hookup by a private plumber the homeowner's responsibility?
Yes, it is. That would be considered the private side costs we talked about a little bit earlier, and in most cases, the state's BRF grant money should be able to cover the private side cost plus the capital facility connection charge. But that is handled by the homeowner, yes.
Okay, looks like the next question had to do with front foot assessments, which was addressed. The next question generally is why is the cost for this being put on the homeowner?
Right, so, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, George, I was just going to say, before you, I figured you would answer this question, but before you do, I just want the folks to, I want to be sure that folks understand, the county is not in business to make a profit. So when we do these projects, we're only recovering the amount that we have invested in the project. So when we were talking about costs earlier and increase in prices and so forth because of our economy and everything that's going on, the county doesn't try to raise the price, or I think sometimes the public perception is that, you know, the county, gee, they're going to make a lot of money on this project. We're not allowed to profit. We get back what we put into it. So when we pay to finance the project, the county just gets back dollar for dollar what it put into it. So just something to keep in mind. And I figured, George, like I said, you'd have more to say on this one.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. That helps. Yeah, and we'll talk about this a little bit more. But the final assessment is based on the final project cost. So everything from tonight to some of the other steps, as they move along, will be estimates and our best engineering evaluation. But at the end of the project, the assessment is based on the actual project cost. I know there was a comment that someone had done something similar in North Carolina and paid a lot less. I can't really speak to what you may have experienced in other places. I know we've developed the costs, based at looking on other historical projects, and if we're able to refine that going forward, we'll certainly do that. We're not, as Ron said, we're just trying to present what we think, what we would expect the cost to be on these projects. There is, one thing that's unique in this area, Anne Arundel County has over, I think, 265 sewage pumping stations, which is a lot of pumping stations for a not so large area. Because of all the rivers and the topography, it does take a lot of effort to get flow from one place to the next, and that's reflected, I think, in the complexity of our collection system, and it's reflected in some of the costs that we see.
All right. Also, if project costs exceed the county's estimate, are the property owners responsible for the extra costs?
So if the costs exceed, so when we go to the ballot, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that later, but if the costs exceed what we've estimated by 15%, the community would have an opportunity to back out at even late in the project. Yes, so yes, within that 15% range. If it's higher than that, then we would come back and ask for another vote.
Okay, and then this question was specifically for Ron. Are these fixed costs or are they adjusted going forward? Since the 20 years of approximately 2.5% inflation would reduce the actual impact of the yearly cost to the homeowner?
Couple things. One, to address that, these are fixed. The assessment is a fixed amount. Inflation will not, make the amount that you pay go up. And again, we have to pay interest. Interest is included. It doesn't change as years go by. And you have to remember one thing. It's pretty important. When in the past, folks basically, there was an amortization schedule, and folks, if they paid early, they could save some money on interest, but that only works if we're charging you interest. The county is going to have to pay back all of the interest from day one. So we won't ever have an opportunity to get a discounted rate on the interest. So therefore, if you were to pay all of your assessment in year one, you're going to pay the same amount as if you paid it all in year 40. So they are fixed costs. One other thing I just wanted to mention is when George just mentioned about the 15% above the amount that was set forth in the assessment ballot, if you voted as a community to go forward and the costs exceeded 15%, yes, the county can ultimately basically abandon the project. The project costs incurred by the county from the preliminary estimate to the time the project is abandoned basically then are charged to the community. So you don't get out of it totally because the costs up to that point do have to be recovered by the county.
Ron, I'm not sure that's an accurate statement.
No, I'm reading it, but
there is a deed petition process that, yes, they would have to pay that back. But I think we should clarify that.
Yeah, we'll clarify that. Yeah.
yes, we will. Thank you.
Okay, next question is the Bay Restoration Tax and the Stormwater Tax. What are these used for so that we need expensive public sewerage?
So let's go real quickly. I mean, the short answer is those funds are already being used for projects in those areas. So the stormwater tax is used to fund our Bureau of Watershed Protection and Restoration. Ricky, if you just want to go to slide 52 real quickly. Watershed Protection and Restoration has been doing hundreds of projects, and we would welcome you to go to their website to learn more about all the different things that they're doing. But that stormwater fee is used to fund their programs and the stormwater and waterway restorations that are part of their capital budget. If you go to slide 54, a lot of the BRF money, so there's money that is used for septic connections, and that's some of the funding that we were talking about earlier tonight for the private side. But a lot of the other funds have gone to support wastewater treatment plant projects. So in Anne Arundel County, over the last 10 years, we've upgraded all of our major facilities, and you can see the improvement of performance that we've had. The state paid for almost half, maybe a little bit more, of these projects, well over $100 million. And I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but so I mean those funds have been used for those purposes. There has been success in those areas, and one of the things that we were trying to do with these changes to the septic program is we've only had something like 300 septic system connections in the last 10 years. So one prong of our multi-pronged approach here was to see if we can make some changes to get more septic system connections, because that's not a sector for nitrogen loads that there's been a lot of improvement on.
Thanks, George. We just have a few more slides, so I'd ask that we get through these last few slides and then address the remainder of the questions at the end.
Ricky, if I may,
Sure.
I do appreciate Brian and George getting me straight. Those costs that I mentioned were to be put in place. It says except when the project costs increase more than 15%, those costs would be recoverable. But when it exceeds 15%, I agree with Brian and George and say that they would not be something the county would try to recover. Thanks, guys.
No problem. So really, the way that works is if we've gone through all the way, so we would take a vote. We're going to go over the petition process. But if the community says, okay, at 30%, yes, we want the county to go forward with the whole design, and the county pays the designer, does all that stuff, and then the community changes its mind for no other reason other than, there's been a change of opinion, then the county would want to try to get reimbursed for those costs. If we take the job to bid and the bids are, way over, then there's an opportunity to back out at that point. Okay, so let's go to the process. I know we have a few more questions, but let's run through the last. We've got about maybe 4 or 5 slides, and then the team will stay on to take as many questions as anyone has. Okay, so let's go over what is the application and petition process. So overall, we would be at step 1, at the beginning of step 1. Okay, so we've had some interest from people in the community about at least learning about the program, and so we're coming out. We're doing this meeting tonight. We've been meeting with communities all through the county from June up through November. If an area is interested, a neighborhood, it doesn't have to be the same boundary area that we showed earlier this evening. But if there's an interest, then we would ask that a community or neighborhood turn in an application, and we'll talk about what the application looks like. It's just that really it's an area, a way for the county to define a potential project area and rank it against other communities, because we wouldn't be able to offer the subsidy to all potential communities every single year. So we developed a ranking system to compare them. We would come back to the community with a little further refined costs, and as basically a second informational meeting. And at that point, going into step 3, the process would be for a neighborhood or community to start the formal petition process. So in step 3, that's when there would be petition forms that would be sent out to everybody in a potential project area, and we would look to see that the majority within the area is in favor of the petition, or at least doing the schematic design part of the petition, right? Once we get that in step 3, basically those forms really go to Ron's group, and then they would come over to our group in utility design. We would do what's known as a schematic design report or a preliminary engineering report, and in that report we would lay out where we think the pumping station would go, or if it was both areas, it would be both pumping stations, and we would refine the costs because we might need to adjust some of these very preliminary layouts we have now. Well, I know we're going to adjust them, but basically make sure that we are basing the costs on our updated layout. We would come back for a formal hearing, which is it's another meeting, so it's a petition meeting, but it's a public meeting, and at that point we would go through the costs, and typically what I go through really the engineering side of it, or whoever is the project manager on that. Ron's group will go over how the assessment would be developed and what would be on a ballot. So we would then send a ballot out to the community for a vote. That's step 4. And that ballot and the assessment will be based on our engineering cost estimate plus the financing charges at that point in the project. If the majority go for vote in favor, then we will move ahead with the final design and construction costs, and construct the project. One thing that's really important to understand is that majority is 50% plus 1. So it is the case that 51% can make the 49% connect. within the project area that's defined in the petition. Once the work is complete, everybody has to connect. It is possible to get an extension on the connection time frame if you recently put in a septic system or a nitrogen removing septic system. But even if you have an extension on the connection time frame, you would still be charged the assessment. So let's look at a little bit more detail in the petition process step. So step one is the community files the petition, and again, that would include a community representative and a project area that would be defined, and forms that would go out to everybody in the project area. We would do a preliminary engineering study and refine the layout and the costs. We would then have a public hearing where we would present the project and what we think the costs are going to be. The ballots would go out in step 4. And in step 5, we would the ballots actually come back to Ron's group and they're counted. If you don't respond, that's counted as a no. So I do see it quickly. I saw a question pop up about who defines the community. So we kind of use the terms community or neighborhood interchangeably. If you think of it this way, the petition is from residents to the county. Saying we would like DPW to investigate, telling us what the cost would be to extend public sewer. So there are some constraints, and we would work with whoever the representative to make sure the area meets the proper constraints. But there's a lot of flexibility too in the area. So I guess back to this slide, if at step 5, the ballot, so the county, we've done a preliminary engineering study, we do the public hearing, we send the ballots out. If the majority vote against the project, that's the end of it, okay? And there's no costs passed back to the community at that point. So if you vote no, then step 5 is the end. If the majority vote in favor, we go to the next slide, which is step 6. And at that point, DPW moves ahead with the final design. We do our plans and specifications. We advertise for construction. We hire the contractor, have the work performed. When the system is ready, there'll be a notice sent out to all the residents that says the system work is complete. It's released for service. And at that point, residents have 9 months to connect. As I mentioned, there can be an extension if you recently had put in a septic system or a nitrogen removal septic system. And then the assessments generally begin the next calendar year after the project. And I think, as we mentioned before, the final assessment is based on the final project cost. So that's actually why the assessments begin the year after the project is completed, because then we'll have all the costs finalized. Okay, so I think we had a bit more questions while I was talking, so I think let's pause and get caught up on that. Let's see. Okay, I lost where we were.
Sure. There is one question about where the $400 per year maintenance costs come from.
So that was the $400 per year usage cost for wastewater. That is a county flat charge, and it's defined as the average usage, and it's currently $130 per, or not 130, 420 divided by $405 per quarter. Sorry. If you were paying more at somewhere else, it's likely they had both water and sewer. were paying both. But I think you can find that quarterly usage charge on the county's website.
Okay, the next question about if the county overruns costs, will the homeowners amount to be more than they signed up for? I believe that was addressed, as well as the question about if the majority decides to go forward. That was addressed. The resident asked if they can use garbage disposals and flexible wipes from public sewer. The answer to flexible wipes is no.
So yeah, I would say grinders, yes, but one of the commenters is saying that the flushable wipes are a problem industry wide, and we would not encourage flushing those down the toilet.
Another question about if project costs exceed 15%. That has been addressed. George, here's a question about Stephen Farms, the Eastern Shore runoff.
Oh, yeah, so I guess just to clarify that one, where if the cost exceeded the 15%, that would be a circumstance where the residents could back out at that point. I think we clarified that, but I just wanted to make sure. If the sentiment in the community changes, and that's let's say the project, there is no change in the cost, but the sentiment in the community has changed. There is a process called the depetitioning process where a community can back out. And it's at that point where the county would seek reimbursement for the costs that have been expended at that point. And at that point, yeah, I guess you would be responsible for costs you receive nothing in return, but that would, I think the idea there is because the county was proceeding to take on costs, and then the community changed its mind. The chicken farms on the Eastern Shore, sure. Let's talk, Ricky, do we have slide 44? Let's go to slide 44. So it's an excellent point that in terms of the Chesapeake Bay and statewide, agriculture is the largest contributing sector. But within Anne Arundel County, agriculture is not this as sizable a sector as this is. And actually, then if you get a little bit more dialed down, even in the Magothy River watershed, actually, why don't you go to the next slide? I'm going to give slide 45. So in this particular watershed, which is also listed as impaired for nutrients, the largest land use is residences. There's close to 10,000 septic systems. A large number of the septic systems in the county are in this area. And from the state's estimate, septic systems contribute 34% of the nitrogen load to the Magothy watershed. So I think, and when we talk about agriculture, it's definitely one of the biggest factors statewide, but it's not as big a factor within Anne Arundel County.
Okay. Let's see. You addressed the question about defining a community area. Here's one. Is there a scenario possible where Chelsea Beach doesn't want to connect, but Magothy Beach does? The sewer is then run through Chelsea Beach into Magothy Beach?
We'd need to take a little bit closer look at that. When one of the constraints on a project area is it has to be continuous from the point of connections to the county system out. So we want to kind of grow our system from where it is now out. So and that's true on a neighborhood level, but it's also true on an individual lot level, right? So we don't skip over lots. I mean, can the two neighborhoods go separately? I think that's yes, if they're in separate drainage areas. Could you go through one to get to another one? That might be possible. I need to look a little bit more when we had a specific area. That would increase the cost, of course, for the one that's further away, because they would basically have to pump through the other neighborhood. But I mean, if that's the way the layout is, then that could still happen.
Okay, next question: will this meeting be made available for viewing again after this evening? The answer to that is yes, and we will detail how you can access those slides and also the recording in just a few minutes here. Next question: what happens if you sell after the vote but before the final assessment?
That's an interesting one that we've been discussing. So it would be ultimately up to you and your realtor, or, you know, if you felt there was an obligation to disclose that an assessment was coming. We are looking at a stance right now that if we are called and people seek cost information as to what's going on, then it looks like the county's position is going to be that we would disclose that information because of the fact that they're inquiring of costs, and it would relate to that property if the process was already underway. This is a process that's being refined right now, so I can't state that as 100% fact, but it will be determined very shortly.
Thank you, Ryan. Next question is with regard to the petition. How will the petition be handled? How can we be assured of the final count?
Ron, is that one that you can answer?
I was on mute. I apologize. Ricky, could you read that to me one more time? I lost the spot.
Sure. How will the petition be handled? How can we be assured of the final count?
How will the vote be handled?
The petition.
Well, the petitions would ultimately be sent out. The approach we're taking right now is to send them out by certified mail. So there is no confusion as to who received and did not receive the petition. We would have the return receipt to document who received it. The votes come in and they are counted by my group, and the results are published. I guess it's never been questioned as to, whether we would count them accurately. I can assure you that would be our 100% goal, but I don't know exactly. I mean, we publish the results. If anyone had a question as to that, the only thing I can think is that they would have to file a Public Information Act request and see if the powers that be in terms of customer relations and our Office of Law agree that that's something that should be a public record, and if assuming they do, they would, that information would be disclosed. But I think there is some expectation of privacy, I would guess, in terms of people who voted. So, if somebody voted for it and the petition passes, and it goes to construction, and those who didn't want it to go through are angry, and they can gain names that way. So it's an issue that would be handled outside of my group once someone requested verification of the count.
Thanks, Ron. And related to that question, would homeowners have to show an ID to vote?
No, we, like I say, we would mail the ballots via certified mail to each residential address, and also the empty lots as well. And ultimately, those have to be returned to us, assuming we get the mail to the right addresses. There is just, by the way, there is just one vote per property. So, for instance, husband and wife own it. If they disagree, I'm not sure how you would settle what vote would go down for that. But I can tell you that any ballot that is not returned in a timely fashion or correctly filled out and signed by all owners of the property, that goes as a vote against the petition project moving forward.
Thank you. The next question has to do with water service, and the resident's asking if they can get the cost for water and sewer. Is that in the petition step?
So, do we have the cost for water, or are we still working on that?
We have a couple of slides on public water extension.
Okay. So we have gotten this question a couple times, probably more than a couple times. So, so we have a little bit of information on public water extension. As I think I mentioned before, there can be some savings on contractor mobilization and sort of overlapping efforts with a design team and an inspection team. Is that, I guess the downside is, you know, the water cost is going to be on top of the sewer cost, right? So we've been talking exclusively tonight about the sewer cost. Water would be on top of that, and that is paid off over a 30-year time frame. And there may or may not be state low-interest loans associated with that. That can depend on the size of the project area and whether there's been any documented water quality issues with the wells. So, do we have rough costs on the next slide? Okay. There's still a capital facility connection charge for a public water extension. So again, this is on top of the sewer one. The project costs are typically somewhere between $25,000 and $35,000 a house, and that is sort of the construction plus the design and the inspection, and that would be financed over a 30-year period. And so we do have here, these are very preliminary because we hadn't really done water system layouts. We've been getting the question a lot, so we're trying to provide some additional information. So that annual amount would be somewhere between $2,300 and $2,900, based on what we've seen for some other water petitions. Generally, the larger a project, you get economies of scale. So the larger project would be probably closer to that $25,000 project cost per house. Okay. But I would also mention there's no BRF grant money available on your private. You'd still have private side costs and public side costs too if you do a water petition, but there's no BRF grant money for your private side water costs. And there's also the subsidy and the partial deferment don't apply to a water system extension.
All right, George, it is a few minutes before 8 o'clock, and we still have a couple more slides in this main deck.
Okay, so let's, right, I tell you what, we can probably finish the formal deck by 8 o'clock, and then the team will stay on to answer more questions. These are great questions tonight. So, so we did have a question earlier about whether you could view the meeting or the slides. So we have set up on our ourwater.org webpage a community page. The link is shown there. You can go directly to that link, and it'll we will have on there the slides from tonight's presentation. The recording will be on in a week or so, and then additional information we may put up there on potential related to sometimes like questions if we have to follow up on those. We will put the link in the chat box. And there's also on the in the box, there's an area to say whether you're interested or you're not interested, or to leave comments. As I mentioned before, we've been doing a lot of these presentations throughout the county, so we're always open to constructive suggestions on the way we've presented things. So let's go to the next. Oh, and the other thing with the link is it's useful if if you have a neighbor or somebody that couldn't actually attend the meeting. We've been saying, you can share the link, they can see the slides, you can warn them about the length of the meeting before they start listening to it. But it's certainly, I think, a good way to be able to share information. Let's go to the next slide about an application. So the application, as I mentioned a while ago, it was really the application process is for us to identify potential projects and kind of rank them against each other. So it's not a particularly rigorous application. We need a community name, we need a contact person, and we need some initial show of support. If the proposed area kind of lines up with a community, with an HOA or a civic association, we could use a letter from that organization and saying that we might be interested, we'd like to submit an application. Another resource that is if you make your if you leave a comment about whether you're interested or not on the web page, we can see those responses, and so that way we can tell so how much interest there might be. We want to emphasize that the application is not binding in any way. It's really just a way for us to look at prospective projects and figure out which areas we might offer a subsidy to. The next slide talks about how we rank the projects, and this is our ranking system. So every project that we get an application in for this year, we're going to rank them with these criteria. I would note that a couple of the key, this particular area in general seems like it would score really fairly well, because it's relatively dense, which would help the total nitrogen pounds. It's a lot of the lots are in the critical area. A lot of the whole area, I think, is in what's known as the on-site wastewater problem area. So I think, in the overall perspective, this area would probably score reasonably well, pretty well actually. We'll be doing this process, as I mentioned, it's a long-term program. We're trying to get 6,000 connections over 30 years. So, we're going to be doing application cycles, and so applications will be valid for 3 years. So that even if a neighborhood didn't get a subsidy offer 1 year, we could probably come back, and hopefully the next year we could come back to that community. And so that's the end of our formal slides. I know we have a few more questions, or maybe a lot more questions, so I'm going to say thank you, but our team is going to stay on, and we will get caught up with the questions. And but thanks for everybody's time tonight, if you need to leave us.
All right, I'm going to jump back into the chat here. For the resident says that much of the public right-of-way in Chelsea Beach is owned by the Chelsea Beach Resident Association. How is access to the right-of-way negotiated with the community? Is it paid for by DPW via the residents' costs, or is it acquired by the county?
We would acquire the easement in most cases. We would try to acquire the easement for the property. In terms of what would be negotiated as a price, I mean, that would be whatever is negotiated. If it was I would say if it was a community, so if the county is paying the community association for the easement, that would become part of the project cost. So it would kind of get rolled back in to the total.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's see.
So I see, does the county, okay, I think I'm getting caught up. Does the county market residents in favor of the project, or is this borne by the community leaders? So one of the pieces of feedback that we got from the septic task force is that the process was a combination of kind of confusing and daunting for the community representatives, and that the county should try to take a little more active role. And although it's still a community-driven process, we're going to try to be available to help define the project boundaries, and and hold informational meetings, like we're doing tonight. And in the previous process, it was very reactive, and it was the county didn't provide as much assistance, I guess, in terms of the petition process. So I think I wouldn't use the word market, because it's if the community feels that this makes sense for them, and they want to see that extension, we're going to be there to provide that service. But we don't, as I think Ricky had said at the beginning, we're not really necessarily even advocating a particular course of action. But the hope is that we make these that we see more communities that can find this to be affordable, because there are benefits more broadly to our nitrogen goals if we can get more connections.
Okay, and it looks like there's some residents discussing septic systems as it relates to selling a home. But the next question has to do with confirming, or at least clarifying, the costs, a ballpark estimate. So the ballpark.
I mean, I'm not checking your math, but I think if the general question is or exclamation is, "Wow, this is really expensive," I think we would say yes, it is. When we first were looking at what was called the state's phase 2, where we were thinking of we might have to connect 20,000 of the 40,000 septic systems, we were getting costs over $1.5 billion, and so that was really where our water program kind of started thinking that we need to come up with some other options on how do we maintain compliance going forward. So that's what the other elements of the program, and while we tried to keep this, instead of say a mandatory connection program of 15,000 homes or 20,000 homes, that we're trying to incentivize as a voluntary program. But it is expensive, yes.
Okay, the next question has to do with voting. If someone owns multiple parcels in Chelsea Beach, will they get one vote per parcel? If the sewer goes through, would they be able to subdivide those parcels into building lots like Green Haven?
So I'll try to answer this the best I can, but I would preface it by saying that I'm not with planning and zoning, so I don't know all those rules. You would get one vote per lot. Okay, there can be exceptions. This in terms of the way we're doing the petition voting. If you have two small lots and the property, and let's say your house extends over the lot, that would actually have to be merged, and so we would take that into account and say, so those two small lots would only get one vote. As we moved to a formal petition, we would really narrow down how many lots. There also could be an option for people to merge lots. So as we were going through the design phase, or the schematic design, I should say, before we get to the ballot, we would be looking more closely at the unique circumstances within the community. Now, once an area is hooked up, the lots can be developed consistent with their zoning. So I don't know if that completely answers your subdivision question, but if that's allowable, then yeah, then that would be allowed.
George, I think it's important to point out there too that the vacant lots, if they get votes, they also get an assessment if it's voted yes. And again, the vacant lots would not receive the benefit of the subsidy or any deferment. So those vacant lots are going to tend to pay more, and that would be fixed. That doesn't. I believe if the lot's built on after the project is completed, they don't retroactively get any subsidy or deferment at that time either. They would pay the full assessment.
Right. If it's developed afterwards, yeah. Let me see. So there was just another question about the easement. So the easement, basically the language would be, if the community association is the owner, then the county would have the right to access the property to maintain the public facilities that are installed there. And so, most times, let's say if it's just a sewer line or a water line, it basically says the county has, the right to come in as initially to install it, and then subsequently for maintenance purposes. One of the things the county would require, let's say with a water line or sewer line, is that it be clear of permanent structures, or you can't put a landscaping wall over. It basically needs to stay clear so our crews can come out and work on it. And so that's kind of the language that's normally in the easement. It would be that the county has permission to access the property and use it for those purposes, and then that area would be defined in a document.
Okay, thank you. It looks like the next question: how does the implementation of sewer change the allowances and what we can do on our properties? Septic systems limit house expansion.
So I'm not an expert really on how the septic system is sized and sort of in terms of, I know there are requirements in Anne Arundel County, I think it's on the health department's website, I think it's called the Private Sewage Disposal Code. I do think there's a linkage between the size of your house, especially if you want to do an expansion, and the size of your septic system. So, and that can be a constraint. I don't know if that always translates also into your drain field size has to change. I would kind of think that it might, because I believe that the underlying idea is that, the larger house has the potential to produce, more flow, so that's going to mean you need a bigger tank, which probably mean you're going to need a bigger drain field. So, so if that's a limitation on your property, then when you're connected to public sewer, that limitation would go away.
Okay. The resident would like to know how we can keep up with what is going on with this process.
So you can contact our team at the ourwater.org, and if there is an application and your particular property is in the application area, you would know about that, because we would be scheduling one of these follow-up meetings. But we would encourage everyone to talk with your neighbors and think about it. So let's see. Would vacant lots become buildable if if the reason the lot is vacant has to do with the septic system installation, then it could become buildable. If it's for another reason, like it's in a sensitive environmental area, I don't think the fact that there's a sewer line in the street would affect that.
Okay, next question. Hookup is not mandatory. Is each lot owner still liable for the $65,000 even if not hooked up?
So the hookup would be mandatory if you're in the project area. You might get an extension on the timing for the hookup. So normally everybody has 9 months to hook up. If you recently put in a septic system or a BAT system, you can request an extension to that, but you would still get the assessment. So I think that answer is, even if you're not connecting, you would get the assessment part of it. You just wouldn't have to do the private side work until you were required to connect.
Okay, and then it looks like the rest are comments and resident dialogue. I do not see any other questions directed toward our team, George.
Okay. Well, we had a lot of great questions tonight. I really appreciate it. And thanks for staying with us. I see a couple questions just came in.
I'll put the link on the site again. I mean, in the chat.
Yeah, we'll put Rakia will put the link in again. And I think that's probably the easiest way. If you have some neighbors that can't get on the internet, and we have sent some separate pieces of information to people, but as you could imagine, it's you don't have the you're sending someone something in the mailer. It's really hard to capture what you spent over 2 hours talking on slides. So if wherever possible, we're trying to direct people to the webpage so they can see the information there. Okay. Well, thanks everyone. We appreciate you joining us, and have a nice evening.
Yes, thank you, folks.
Recording stopped.